by the Committee on Guam U.S. Military Relocation, Public Safety, Judiciary is hereby convened. Just for the information of the public, the initial notification to the community was disseminated on the 21st of August to all of my colleagues in the legislature, to the stakeholders within the judiciary, and also with some additional communications and names and recipients provided by the Judiciary of Guam because of the nature of this presentation. The second notification also was disseminated on the 27th. So in conformity with the open government law, we want to thank our media partners for also sharing the information and ensuring that this is properly notified. Today, the Judiciary of Guam will be providing a presentation, and this is as a result of their facilitation and partnership with the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, in which they had conducted an extensive review of their juvenile probation office. The review has been completed, and the Judiciary of Guam will now present its findings and recommendations to the committee, and most especially to the people of Guam. The roundtable discussion will include the following items: a review of the findings and recommendations on the Juvenile Justice Status Report, and the progress made on the 4 focus areas identified by Chief Justice Robert J. Torres during his call to action last September. So on that note, I would like to turn the facilitation and the discussion to Chief Justice Torres.
Hafaday and good morning, Senators. Thank you for hosting us this morning, and Hafaday and good morning to all of our stakeholders who are here as well, present, including the Chief of Police, the Superintendent of the Department of Education, and the Director of the Department of Youth Affairs. In a continuing effort to enhance the policy, practice, and service provisions for youth and families involved with the Judiciary of Guam, we undertook a comprehensive probation system review utilizing the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice. The process included a review and examination of the policy, practice, and service provisions designed to inform immediate opportunities for system enhancement, improvement, and reform. With me today is one of the seminal authorities on probation review, Mr. John Toole from the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, as well as his colleague, Carrie Harp. John and Carrie have done a comprehensive examination of our probation system review since we initially contracted with them nearly a year ago. And John will talk about the examination that's been gone and the recommendations. There are a number of recommendations that are being made to talk about the way in which we can enhance and improve upon the system that we have for comprehensive juvenile justice reform. And so I'll just ask John to, I guess, pick up the ball and run with it now and provide some of the discussions about the review that was undertaken and the recommendations that are being made.
Thank you, Chief Justice Torres, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure for Carrie and I to be here and to talk with you about the results of our comprehensive review over the past year. We actually launched this in October. And we're pleased to be able to present these findings and recommendations for the consideration of the Judiciary of Guam and the Probation Division for implementation. So Carrie and I are going to talk a little bit using the backdrop of this PowerPoint presentation, because we wanted to have in front of you the framed 15 recommendations, the language of those recommendations. We want to give a little bit of the background to that, and certainly welcome throughout the course of our time together this morning any questions, observations, or reactions that you have to our findings, and certainly to the nature of the recommendations that we're putting forward. So on behalf of Carrie and I from the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, it's a thrill to be here, and we'd introduce this topic by saying we have worked with a collegial group, a professional group, a group of leadership here in the Judiciary and in the Probation Division that has distinguished itself in the way it has presented them, each one of them, as honest, open, candid in this introspective review of what is currently the method of practice for the Probation Division. So pleased to be here, and good morning. Well, actually, a little bit of background. Let me just share with you by way of education for everyone. We are the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, and actually, we just launched in January of 2014. but the launch was on the basis of some work that had been going on for the past 15 years. And the primary area of our focus is around the reforms of juvenile justice systems and their relationships with relevant youth serving systems, particularly in one of our primary areas of focus, what we call the dual status youth. Those youth who have a history of involvement in the child maltreatment or child protection system who are penetrating into the delinquency system. We also have focused necessarily, as you might guess, out of that work on information sharing and data sharing across those systems, which is an integral part of those systems being able to work together on behalf of those youth. And the third primary area is the area we're here to talk to you about this morning, and that's the conduct of a probation system review to try to improve the outcomes for those youth who were referred into the juvenile justice system and subsequently penetrate into the delinquency system and into the probation division of the Judiciary of Guam. Our preferred method for the way in which we work with our partners in the field is on-site partnership using an array of publication resources, but also utilize distance learning as we have in this particular methodology as well through our partners with the National Youth Screening Assessment Project. Professional mentoring networks are a part of our work, conference training, and a variety of social media outlets to spread the word on the good work that's being done around the country in this arena. And I think I can share with everybody in the audience today that we are able to report on some excellent work that's going on here and some excellent attention to improvement in some of those practices that will result in great outcomes for the youth here on Guam. So, a little bit of our history. There's some establishment of credibility with the audience, if you will. So very briefly, really this is undertaken to enhance policy, to practice, and then obviously the service provision for youth and families involved with juvenile probation systems and the departments or agencies with whom they work to effect this change. The slide presents a number of jurisdictions where we've done our work over the course of the last decade. One jurisdiction that's obviously very familiar to the demographics here in Judiciary of Guam, certainly the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles. Similar size, similar demographics. I'm checking for who's paying attention. All right. So both large and small is the point that I'm making here, folks. The county of Los Angeles, certainly the Judiciary of Guam, and some of the smaller jurisdictions noted on here from Newton County and Georgia is roughly the same census population as the youth population here on Guam. I would also hasten to add that the framework that we used in the past 10 months with Judiciary of Guam has resulted in a curriculum that we partnered with the American Probation Parole Association to deliver our inaugural Juvenile Probation Reform Academy in Los Angeles at their Summer Training Institute just last month. So it's work that's gaining steam, and I think it's safe to say that on the other side of this report release, it will gain more steam as a result of the work that's being done here as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Harp. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. As we get into the recommendations this morning that were a result of our time here, we wanted to start first with an explanation of the logic and the philosophy behind the probation system review itself. As you can see on the screen, a probation system review is an opportunity to enhance practice by making sure that the policies and procedures, the training, the management structure, and the supervision of probationers are all lined up to reflect best practices, and I would add core principles. Often when we hear the term best practices, we think of a limited best program, if you will, or a best smaller initiative or program that you could capture. For example, motivational interviewing is something some of you may have heard about. It's a technique that's used in probation to engage with families. But as we undertake the probation system review, we are really looking at implementing core principles that have been shown by numerous research studies to improve the outcomes of youth. These core principles can be found in a white paper, if any of you are interested, that was published in 2014 by the Council of State Governments, and it's called Core Principles to Reduce Juvenile Recidivism and Improve Youth Outcomes. The reason I highlight that is because we wanted to make sure that it was clear from the beginning of this probation system review that the entire goal was to improve youth outcomes, and that these core principles that we have integrated into our recommendations are actually based on meta-analyses of the data that has worked to improve youth outcomes. So again, we're not looking strictly at evidence-based programs, if you will, in a more capsulated manner, but instead these principles that have been shown over numerous studies over decades to improve youth outcomes. Those 4 core principles include basing decisions for supervision, service, and resource allocations on a validated risk and needs assessment. So actuarial risk and needs screening and assessment that will connect a youth's needs to their case plan. The second is adopting and effectively implementing programs that have been shown to reduce recidivism and improve youth outcomes. So in essence, choosing those programs to connect youth to that we know work. And the only way we know that they work is if there are data collection efforts that also go along with that. So that is part of core principle number 2. Core principle number 3 that has been shown to work is employing a coordinated approach across system agencies to meet the youth's needs. Again, thinking outside of just the box of our particular system, or in this case, just the probation department, but recognizing that these youth touch multiple systems. And when we come together and collaboratively address their needs, that has been shown to increase the improved outcomes for these youth. The 4th core principle is tailoring systems, programs, and policies and supervision to reflect the unique developmental needs of adolescents. Current research has now determined very clearly that juveniles are not many adults. They are different. They have biological, cognitive, and emotional differences that need to be taken into account when we look at what enhanced practices will improve their situations. And any department that is looking at comprehensive reform, this is the time to pay attention to what the research is saying to us. It's new, it's somewhat different, it's requiring us to approach the youth with a frame of mind that necessarily we haven't always had, particularly coming out of the 90s. But we hope that as we move through the recommendations, you'll see that all 4 of these core principles and that one also are reflected. I'd also like to take a moment quickly and mention that in our work with the probation review management team, whom was created to guide us through this process, they created a new vision statement for their work, and all 4 of these core principles are woven into those vision statements. One thing we'd like to highlight as we move forward is that these core principles are actually being used effectively in other jurisdictions. In Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, when the review was conducted there, they implemented several of these principles and as a result saw some significant improvements in their numbers. Also, again, because they created a data collection and evaluation process. Otherwise, these numbers would not be available to us. The first number I'd like to share with you is, as a result of their probation system review, they saw a 37% decrease in the number of youth on probation because they were screening more effectively for low, medium, and high risk, therefore using their resources more effectively. Their recidivism rate decreased by 33%, starting at 50% down to 23%. They also saw a 92% increase in youth who were referred to evidence-based programs through service providers in their community. The last statistic I will share with you is that because of their improvement in the screening and assessment areas, they saw a 23% decrease in their mental health evaluation costs because they were screening out the youth who didn't necessarily need those full evaluations and were therefore able to reallocate the costs to provide more intensive services and evidence-based services to those youth who had the specific mental health needs. So undertaking a probation system review provides a structure to review the key elements necessary to create an effective and efficient probation department, ensuring that it is founded on these core principles, which to the end is always to improve youth outcomes. Very briefly, the origin of our relationship at the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice began in May 2013 at the National Center for State Court Summit in Seattle, Washington. Chief Justice Torres and Joshua Tenorio, the administrator of the courts, were in attendance, and they were able to make acquaintance with John Toole, the executive director, sitting to my left. They began talking about the importance of probation system review, and at that time they said, yes, let's move forward with conducting one here in Guam. And the purpose was to determine how the Guam Probation Department could be improved by reflecting implementation and use of these evidence-based practices and approaches. Again, to become an exemplary model for the delivery of probation services. Through the support of the Administrative Office of the Courts and the Judiciary of Guam, the review began in October of 2014 and concluded in August 2015 with the creation of the report that we are going to be covering for you today. Out of that report, we have come up with 15 recommendations as a result of the review, and as part of that, we conducted 4 site visits, both my colleague and I, and we also conducted several phone calls long distance with the probation review management team and other methodologies that I will cover in just a moment. This probation system review process was not something that was made up overnight. As John Toole mentioned, it has a long history in doing work in probation review across the United States. The seminal document that we were using to conduct this review was written in 2011 by the support of the MacArthur Foundation and was based on the expertise and experience in the field of John Toole and his colleague Janet Wigg. In order to provide a structure for the review, there are 4 elements within this guidebook under which there are several categories of questions that we address. Again, we don't come in just hoping that we can figure out what the issues are. This is the framework that was used because it's been used effectively in other communities. I would also like to mention that this is a framework and not a model that allows us to work with a jurisdiction in order to identify what their particular needs are under these 4 elements. Very briefly, the first element is program planning and implementation, which covers the policies, procedures, training, the management practices, and the mission and vision that guide the work of the probation department. The second is best practices and benchmarking. We worked with the team to create a map that shows the process a youth enters and goes through when they come into the juvenile justice system, through all the decision-making points to when they leave the system, and identified where best practices based on those core principles were already taking place and where there would be some more opportunities to integrate those into that entire process. Benchmarking speaks to setting those goals within a department based on, again, your data collection. Where is our recidivism rate at the moment, and what would our benchmark like to be? Again, that goes back to having an effective data collection and evaluation process, which leads us into element 3, which looked at performance management and client outcomes. What are your goals? What defines youth success here in Guam? And how will we be collecting that data so that you can come back and say after a year, 2, 3, 5, that this initiative made a difference to the youth here in Guam? And the fourth one that we will cover is intra and interagency relationships, going back to that core principle that I mentioned that said systems must collaborate in order to truly affect and improve outcomes for youth. We looked at the relationship that the probation division has within the juvenile justice system partners, the court, the judiciary, as well as those relationships that take place outside of the court with service providers, schools, other entities such as that police department, and so on. Because there are interchanges that happen, interfaces and communication that goes back and forth between these agencies, referral systems and processes happen. So we took a look at what those systems were currently looking like at the moment. All of this can be found, as I mentioned, going back into in this probation review guidebook, and if anyone is interested, it is located for anyone's downloading interest on the rfk.nrcjj.org website. One thing I will conclude with is I mentioned that there were several methodologies as part of this review, so these are the elements, but how did we actually get to the information that would inform these elements? The methodologies included a detailed review of the documents that guide the delivery of services, including the standard operating procedures, the mission and vision, those pieces that I mentioned already. It also included stakeholder interviews with those partners that I mentioned, both within and outside of the juvenile justice system. We conducted an employee survey with the probation officers and probation supervisors. And we held multiple meetings with, as I mentioned, the probation review management team, as well as group interviews and individual interviews. At this time, we are going to start getting into the meat of the recommendations and the findings that came from this report, and I will turn it back over to my colleague John to begin talking about those.
Thanks, Carrie. We wanted to make sure that we gave you the entire backdrop on the comprehensive nature of the review. You weren't seated with us throughout the review, although we've met many of you throughout the course of the review, and I know many in the room were part of that interview structure that allowed us to gain a clear understanding of how things worked in the courts and in the probation division. So I hope that you found that helpful. But we're at a point now where we're going to talk about our recommendations. The methodologies, I should mention real quickly, that Carrie referenced are articulated with greater clarity on pages 3 through 6 of the final probation system review report. I'd say we relied heavily on the probation review management team. We relied heavily on them because they were demonstrating to be great leaders, wonderfully open to the kind of changes, and wonderfully open to the kinds of examination and analysis that we were bringing and heaping upon them during the course of this review. So let's start with element A. There's just a look at the report. Categorizing that in element A, I'll be discussing 8 recommendations. Element B, 2 recommendations. Element C, regarding performance measurement and outcomes, 3 recommendations. I'll be handing the floor back to Carrie to articulate the 2 recommendations about the inter- and intra-agency work processes that are part of element D as well. So, in terms of our first recommendation, revise the standard operating procedures to include the following components. And they're articulated on the slide, but we've referenced the fact that an effective organization must function with a clear mission, and clear specific outcomes to juvenile probation, both youth and system outcomes. A clear understanding of the recidivism definition that we were using within the probation division so that we knew what our target was. Effective organization needs that in place. And that it was, this manual will then be driven forward with that understanding on one of our core principles about the adolescent, the neuroscience of adolescent development. So this particular recommendation was built on the fact that what we found was that the standard operating procedures were out of date. They weren't current. They did not identify a clearly articulated mission, vision, goals, and objectives, and did not really articulate that which the division would be held accountable for in terms of recidivism definition that was understood by everybody working within that division. Now that may sound like a rather harsh finding, and throughout we're going to articulate the findings. But what I can say is that throughout the course of this review, because of the dynamic nature of the leadership, we're not just presenting this report and hoping that they're creating this. Carrie's already referenced that the team has worked to identify the mission statement, the vision statement that is consistent with these principles, that identifies the adolescent research, the neuroscience of adolescent development in the research and in these findings as that's the way they're going to work going forward. And they are currently crafting a recidivism definition that gives clarity to the division on what it is they're going to be held accountable for, at least in terms of that measure. And that is a step forward. As we identify in recommendation number 1, this is important. I can tell you that across the country, we find a significant deficiency in this particular arena, and we find very little progress despite recommendations to go forward with these. So I congratulate the division, as I will almost routinely throughout the course of this presentation this morning, on the dynamic nature in which they're already attending to these recommendations. This is certainly one of those. So we also found that there was a lack of clarity on part of probation officers, juvenile probation officers, with regard to whether or not their function and role was to monitor, whether or not it was to have some sort of role in creating positive behavioral change or improving that behavioral status in a number of arenas, whether or not it was just enforcing the orders of the court. That left open the fact that juvenile probation officers could, to some extent, randomly function more in one case on monitoring, more in one case on trying to help that youth change that behavior. So we are asking in our recommendations that the juvenile probation officer role and responsibility that highlights a balance between monitoring of conditions and supporting positive behavioral change be committed with greater clarity within this policy and procedure moving forward, and starts to be a part of the fabric of the way in which we train juvenile probation officers. The research is pretty clear. If we just focus on monitoring, we have very little effect on reduction of recidivism. When we balance that with the efforts to change behavior in a positive way, we have a much greater impact on the safety, public safety, and the reduction of the recidivism. So those would be the first 2 recommendations. And I invite questions, observations throughout. Welcome that. We're using this as a backdrop, using this as a guidance, but you don't have to hold the questions till the end if you have them, okay, or reactions. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which contains 3 recommendations. Number 3, probation and the courts collaboratively explore the use of incentives and graduated sanctions when working with probationers. We just had the privilege of being on the morning radio show, and I used the term, we're not talking about softer, we're talking about smarter. When employed correctly, that we use incentives to motivate the youth to change that behavior. Actually, the research is pretty clear. We're going to have a much more significant impact on protecting public safety and ameliorating the risks for reoffending among those youth. Youth respond to positive incentives. That is not in the absence of accountability mechanisms, but it is in balance with accountability mechanisms. Research is clear, our recommendation is based on that research, and we want the probation division and the courts to work collaboratively to institute protocols that drive juvenile probation officer activities toward providing incentives and rewards when positive behavior is exhibited. Recommendation number 4, explore opportunities to increase family engagement in the court process, in case planning, and in the delivery of services. Oftentimes, juvenile courts, juvenile probation divisions are focusing on the youth, and appropriately so. But when we focus only on the youth without an appropriate balance toward recognizing the situation in which that youth lives, then we fail. Or at least we have much less chance of success. So while we didn't explore this exhaustively, we certainly got sufficient feedback from probation officer interviews, from the management team, from some of the stakeholders and collaborators with whom we interviewed, that there could be a more effective identification of how it is we engage the family from the start, in a different way, in a supportive way, even with the dysfunction that we face with these youth. Make that a more supportive way. There are methods of practice, methods of engagement for families, even the most dysfunctional families, that bring us a greater chance of achieving a positive outcome for those youth. And what we've provided in the report, in one of the appendix documents, is some of the best and most significant guidance on the way in which we can begin to construct, when we implement these recommendations in partnership with the probation division, begin to construct a true framework, a true model for the way in which we engage these families that will give us a greater chance of this kind of success. Yes, sir. Oftentimes, systems, and my history also involves working as a probation officer in a jurisdiction in Virginia. My perspective at that time was, these families are the reason why this juvenile is here. Why are you telling me I have to work with them? I want to work with the youth to give him or her instruction, methods, and means by which they might be able to function within that family. But we must work with that family in order to really integrate that. One of those examples is that it's not just at the time we get into court that we ask them what they think, but perhaps as they're introduced into the court, and some of the mechanisms that are part of these recommendations will include more kind of multidisciplinary team approaches to bringing the family and the youth into if you will, a conversation about what's gone wrong, what are the strengths, what are the assets, also what are the liabilities, what are the weaknesses, and what are the risks. Engage the family from the very start upon their perspectives, so that we're not just bringing them into a courtroom in an adversarial proceeding and saying, what's wrong? In fact, we're working with them to help us construct a plan that might be more viable because they've been part of that plan. And then some other methodologies that actually rely on those families to be a part of our management and oversight, so that they're partners with us in that, and that they're therefore partners with us in kind of managing the case as we go forward. Again, so that's not meant to be soft, but it is meant to recognize that we're going to achieve a greater degree of success if we're working with that family in that way throughout the life of the case.
I understand. I handled juvenile court for 10 years, so I'm trying to hear from you what more we could have done to engage the families. I see some of the people in here that I worked with when I was handling it, and we had families in, and it wasn't all adversarial. And I was lucky that I was able to handle it at a time when there was money, and we were able to actually give families their own counsel to assist in so that they would be represented, and we could work together. Now I understand the ability to be able to provide counsel to families and to the children is limited, and so I'm trying to figure out how you're doing.
One of the
more.
big changes that we're implementing is the implementation of the chosen risk needs responsivity tool, which is the SAVERY. And the Savory is going to give us an ideal opportunity to begin engaging with families more collaboratively based on assessing the strengths and the needs of the family domain using this evidence-based practices, which we didn't enjoy 20 years ago. You didn't have the availability of an evidence-based risk and needs assessment that could evaluate the family domain in the manner that we're going to be utilizing. We actually already have undertaken Savory training, I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, with quite a significant number of people involved in that process. So that's going to be, I think, give us the opportunity to look at some of that didn't exist before.
Well, with all due respect, the problem is that too many are breeding without having an understanding of the responsibility of parenting. And that's, I think we've got to go back to that, where we've got to get DOE into doing parenting in school, because too many people are just breeding but not understanding the responsibility of having children. I mean, one of my favorite cases was I was sitting on the bench and I looked down and this young man was in there for having come to school drunk. And he was sitting between his mother and his attorney, and he looked up at me and he smiled. And I said to the parents, I said, I'm glad that you brought him here this afternoon. Did you pick him up at school and take him home? Oh no, we came here directly. I said, so you mean he's been dressed like this since he left this morning for school? Oh yes, sir. And so I looked at the counsel and I said, counsel, did you speak to your client before you came in this afternoon? Oh yes, Your Honor. I said, okay. Young man, stand up. And stand up. I said, walk to the front of the counsel's table and turn around. So I said, counsel, read me what's on this shirt. I drink, I get drunk, I fall down, no problem.
I think that what we were formulating in this particular recommendation, probably I would be better served by saying that we have some of those same practical experiences, and I understand that. What we're promoting in a recommendation here is a routine methodology that at least gives us a greater likelihood that if we engage in a practice that has brought about greater family engagement, greater family involvement in the case planning, despite the deficiencies that these families bring to this system, that we'll at least experience a greater likelihood that we will work more successfully with those families. There are models, and I realize in this conversation that model or that evidence-based approach of family engagement, such as a family group conferencing approach, may not resonate with you at this particular time, particularly in light of where you see the issue even beginning. But at the point the family's coming into the juvenile justice system, the Juvenile Probation Division can begin to work with a methodology that has proven to be effective, proven to create the kind of family engagement and involvement that does have a research finding that says it does improve the outcomes for these kids. That more often than not, if we're routinely engaging in that kind of methodology, that kind of process, we're going to experience a greater level of success. Maybe not in that case, sir. Maybe not. I don't know enough details about that, certainly. But in the matter of routine practice, we think we can institutionalize a practice within the Juvenile Probation Division here, and that's the source of this recommendation that takes advantage of those kinds of approaches that will get us closer to the positive outcomes, despite the deficiencies they bring to the system.
I understand, and in like working with DOE, in trying to get these quote-unquote families to attend to their children, I asked them, did you attend the parent-teacher meeting? And the looks I would get would be like, did you ask me if I shot my child or if I killed somebody? Because they're like, what? I'm expected to do that?
That's part of what I'm talking about here. The environment we're trying to create is that there's, right from the start, there would be a methodological approach to understand all the expectations, obviously to also understand the deficiencies, but also to understand the strengths. Working with those families in a different way, despite the deficiencies, and where those families can't rise up to that, then we look extended beyond that into kin or other family members that may help to provide some stabilizing force. If we're doing that more meaningful with a protocol that secures that we're going to do that in each instance, we're going to reach more families.
Okay, that's
We're
why
gonna
I'm
achieve
asking for more examples and more detailed of how you plan on engaging breeders as opposed. I mean, I hate using that word, but it just disgusts me that so many people are having children and have no idea what their responsibilities are as parents.
I made mention earlier of a technique called motivational interviewing, and I would draw your attention to that if you're interested in doing any research on it. Motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice that does engage family members, it engages youth, it engages anyone actually under any circumstance in identifying what their goals are and helping them talk through what their particular barriers are to reaching those goals. And it really does begin with understanding that there's a strength-based approach to working with these families. In our experience with multiple years of working with child welfare and probation, there are always some strengths to be built upon within a family. And so often it's hard for us to immediately identify them, let alone build on them. But bringing in these two particular techniques, they offer a new way to engage and interact with this youth and family. First, identifying where those strengths are and what can be built upon them. Going back to the positive reinforcement that John also mentioned, what can this family be praised for? And then third, also employing those motivational interviewing techniques that have been shown to reduce the barriers that people have within them to achieving their own goals.
I fully understand that what you're recommending is really based on research and what has really worked. But my concern is that the development of youth, it's not just the families that have influence in their socialization, their growth and development. The school system, their peers, have a tremendous amount of influence in the way they look at themselves and how they look at the world. So I am just wondering at what point, as you provide support for the modification of behavior, is the school system engaged in this approach? Because they do spend, 6 or 7 hours
Yes.
of their time in school.
Very good
from
point.
the time that they are in kindergarten or,
I will actually reiterate what Chief Justice Torres referred to as the domains that are covered in the risk needs assessment, the SAVORY. The peer domain is one domain that the youth is assessed for both risk and needs and strengths, as well as the school domain. So right now when a youth comes into the juvenile justice system without the valuable information that is gleaned through a SAVORY risk assessment, it's very hard to understand where this particular youth needs the most assistance. Is it because they're hanging out with deviant peers? And is family actually a strength in their life that we could be building upon when we conduct a strong case plan? Is school an area of weakness, or is school perhaps an area of strength, once again, that we should be building on? The assessment will provide that specificity that will empower both the probation officer in working with the youth and the family and everyone in the system to tailor their needs.
Thank you.
And specifically, we'll be addressing the educational relationship with the probation division in recommendation number 7 and recommendation number 14. Okay? Actually, the magic, if you will, of the SAVORY instrument is probably all of the concerns that you guys bring from your experience to this table are recognized in that kind of structured decision-making model. It helps us to understand across all domains where there's risks, where there's strengths, so that we can create a comprehensive case plan. If I could go back to your examples, those are not unrealistic examples. They are very real examples. You've shared them. They will continue to present themselves. But if we employ a practice, and they will continue to defeat us in many instances from being 100% successful with whatever research model or practice model that we're implementing here. But by implementing family group conferencing or child and family team meetings or other family engagement models for the way in which we interact with them and the way we develop their relationship with us from case entry all the way to case closure, we will experience a higher degree of success even with some of the most extreme cases as you depicted in your example.
But what I was depicting was not extreme cases. I wasn't talking about a murder. I was talking about a young man who had a drinking problem, and a drinking problem at school. And yet, He was at school for the 6 or 7 hours that he was, and not one teacher made him turn that T-shirt inside out.
I don't want
And, you know, he walked around proudly with his shirt with the four boxes of I drink, I get drunk, I fall down, no problem. And no one. And that's a simple one, you know. And so I'm trying to ask you, what specific examples do you have of engagement? And for parents, you have 2 superintendents here. I dare you to ask them what the attendance is at the parent-teacher meetings. And how are you going to improve these breeders being interested in their children's education?
Our recommendations won't address the breeders, but our recommendations will address the fact
You're
that
the
they
ones
come-
having children.
Right, but let me just interject that I think you need to recognize where we are in the system. We're not responsible. We're in the court, we're dealing with all of those things that you recognize and you're suggesting. We're the last gate, and we're the last opportunity to do some intervention, because whatever happened in the past has either failed or has not worked. So I guess we preface it by saying that, we recognize that we're kind of like the last resort. Actually, when you come to the court, this is it. And I guess what we're trying to tell you is we have a bunch of different things that we're trying to do to change the way that we operate. Change the way we've operated for 35 years to try and identify all the areas that are in need of attention or sometimes in need of rescue.
I understand that, Joshua, very clearly. I mean, 45 years ago, I almost got thrown out of a legislative hearing because I used that very example. Actually, I was more explicit in using that the judiciary is the sphincter. It controls where to squirt it. But the problem is teaching people of what they put in their mouth. How do we get to that front part?
Well, I mean, that's something that all of us are going to have to
No, I
answer.
understand, and that's why I'm trying to say.
I'm just saying that I'm not sure that you should hold us the most responsible for addressing that. We have a role, just like all the other agencies do. And I think that what we're trying to establish here is that we're trying to establish a gate in which we're going to try and save as many of these cases as possible and shift them into focused attention. Now, when we kind of just went over the Savory tool, and maybe there's going to be a portion in this presentation that talks about it. This risk and needs assessment tool is the most critical point, in my opinion, in this entire effort. Part of it is it allows us to identify all of the risks and the needs of each individual, but the outcome is it comes up with a structured case plan, an individualized case plan. Many times in the past, I think that we've been putting people in boxes or hurting them, as numbers. This tool allows us to give specific individualized attention to the needs of the child and come up with a case plan that attempts to try and correct behavior or identify areas in which we need to focus more social human service attention or law enforcement attention because of the things that we're finding out in the home. I think a lot of it is each agency catches things. There's no integrated way in which the information is actually used to do something about it. And to do something about it means to come up with a case plan that is going to address each individual factors of the child in this case. So, I mean, that's kind of where we're at.
Mr. Tool?
Yes, sir. So if I could, those kinds of deficiencies will undercut our ability to be successful with these families. The focus of the recommendation was to ensure that we are going to work more collaboratively, maybe in a different way with those families. Perhaps if we're working differently with them, we might be able to get some self-identification on the kinds of treatment interventions that they would be willing to undertake so we can further stabilize an unstable situation such as that which you depict, which I know to be true in many of the cases, if not a majority of the cases that are brought to the attention of the juvenile court. So I appreciate the concern that you're raising. I hope over the time that the probation division can recognize we do need to work more collaboratively and investigate the ways in which we can begin to change that behavior at that point anyway. Thank you. So, recommendation.
Mr.
Yes,
Trust, I believe
I'm
the
sorry.
AG's representative.
Hi.
Oh, yes, hey.
Hi, good
Carol?
morning.
Good morning.
You can identify yourself for the record.
Yes, I'm Carol Hinkle-Sanchez, Deputy Attorney General for the Juvenile Division with the Office of the Attorney General of Guam. Good morning, Senators, Vice Speaker. I just wanted to point out, and Vice Speaker is very familiar with the program, we are actually taking measures to kind of take it before initiating action that's going to occur that happens before we actually get into the court systems. One of the programs we're trying to launch, and I know John Fernandez is just leaving, but most of the people on the table are aware of it, is the Child Sexual Abuse Education Curriculum, which also addresses your concerns of this engagement of parent and just this teaching of what's in their mouth and just respecting their bodies and what they say. We're hoping to launch that program this April, or this coming April, in this school year. And we're working with the Department of Education closely with the program. We're going to start training in 2-3 weeks from now is our first training with the first part of the elementary level, and then we go into middle and high in October, and then February we're going to do the remainder of the elementary, and then they're going to launch it, which we're going to speak with you directly because we may need some stuff to have this happen so that it's done. There's a timing during Child Sexual Abuse and Sexual Violence Awareness Month. The other thing we're working with the courts on, and I know it was part of the report that was submitted, just a really small part of it. We do plan on using the risk assessment. I've been speaking with the Guam Police Department, as well as Inafa Malik. It's another one of your babies, which is the restorative justice part. We're hoping to use the SAVRI or part of the SAVRI or somewhat the general idea of SAVRI in determining high-risk, low-risk offenders, so we can divert them into the restorative justice, so they're never brought before court, because we think that there are some that that just need that type of program where it involves the community, where it's going to be before a peer mediation group, which is not just juvenile but also adults that are trained to do restorative justice. And so we're hoping to use that SAVRI tool to identify low-risk offenders that we can divert and not even bring into the court system. So that's, what they're doing, what they're talking about. And we've been working with the Judiciary. Josh and I have been talking about, and Danielle, closely on these things. And so those are some of the things that we're working on aside from what's being reported today. There's bits and pieces in it, but that's basically what is happening. That kind of is the preventive side of it. Is we're working with the schools, we're working with the police department, because we want to build a relationship with these juveniles that we think are have offended, but could be treated through this process where it engages not just the offender and the victims and the panel, but it also engages the family. It makes the family responsible. So the panel is going to tell the family, this is what you guys all have to do, and the victim's a part of this whole process. I've worked with an Malik. I just spoke with GPD recently about it, because it's a diversion that happens even before it gets to the court. It happens right at our office. There is no probation. They're on a contract, a monitoring contract, where they complete and are held accountable for their actions and complete the same process as they would had they gone to court. The only difference is it's not probation. So basically that's kind of what's going on in our end.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Tu.
Thank you. On recommendation number 5, this would not be one of those that would be regarded as really glamorous, maybe not of significant interest, but there's good research existing on the effectiveness of well-defined meeting structure within an organization for the variety of necessary reasons. We articulate in research a number of those reasons. We work with the Probation Review Management Team during the course of this review to identify those reasons and actually inventory all the meetings that took place. And I think our findings were that the Probation Division has many meetings. They sometimes overlap. They're not always efficient. They're not always effective in the goals and purpose and outcomes of those meetings. So what we're recommending here is a refined management approach to address the structure, the frequency, and the purpose that enhances the communication and oversight for day-to-day operations, for problem solving, inclusiveness in policy making, and departmental cohesiveness. That's internal and external. Because obviously that constitutes a number of the meetings with probation department, with schools, with behavioral health providers as well. And that ensures that you have the communication forum and the routine nature of those to address any issues and really manage the effective operations of the probation division. So not all that glamorous, not all that sexy, but a critical part of what we found, and certainly a willingness on the part of the Probation Review Management Team to look at that particular aspect. The next slide contains 3 more recommendations. We are talking about a refined departmental training curriculum. If we're fundamentally changing the focus of the kinds of activities in which the probation division is going to be engaged, we can't just tell them that we're going to do that. We must engage in a training so that there can be the learning of how it is that you do that. And the training curriculum currently, based on our findings, was that it satisfied the mandates of the requirements for training, but it may not have satisfied that which was pre-service orientation, in-service, and special skill development that allowed the probation officers to really carry out the skills that we think are going to be necessary to implement the SAVRI, to improve the relationships with education and community service providers, perhaps to improve the relationship with law enforcement, all the different partners that we have to work with. There needs to be a training curriculum that recognizes all 4 of those key aspects, that is kind of comprehensively planned. It needs to be efficient. There's a lot of training opportunities for the JPOs, not necessarily all accessible, not necessarily all focused on those kinds of activities that are critical to their functioning. So again, 5 and 6 start to take on the recognition for the folks in the room today that we were looking at the actual function, operations, planning, and management of the probation division, as well as the way in which we interact and oversee the youth in the community and our court processes with the AG's office and with Judiciary as well. Recommendations number 7 and 8 have to do with the communication between schools, probation, school resource officers, and the probation division. And Carrie's going to address that in a little bit more detail in a discussion when we get to recommendation number 14. Same as with number 8, collaboratively work with providers to develop a method for evaluation of services and incorporates opportunities to assess outcomes as well as the client's level of effort. She'll speak to that more, but this speaks to the notion that at this point, what we found was an inconsistent relationship between JPOs and the providers, an inconsistent opportunity to understand what the providers were telling JPOs about client participation, what was the specific modality of treatment that those youth and or families were engaged in, so that the probation officers could either support or challenge that modality as necessary or targeted enough. And so we think that can be significantly improved, and this recommendation will address the fact that it starts internally to perhaps develop a protocol for the way in which JPOs will be working with those providers in the field. A key part, ultimately, since so many of our youth are in need of these external resources, a key part of a juvenile probation officer's job in order to achieve the outcomes we seek. So, recommendation number 9 comes back to the best practices and benchmarking. We've moved into element B. And we've had some significant conversation, at least early on here, about the adoption of the structured assessment of violence risk for youth. That's what you've heard called the SAVRI. It is a research-based, when validated and normed for a local jurisdiction, will allow us to get a clear understanding of the youth's risks and needs in a set of domains that includes the kinds of things that are proven to have an impact on whether or not we're going to reduce the risk for reoffending and we're going to improve the positive behavioral change. We worked with Louisiana to help them implement this SAVRI, and as Carrie said earlier, some of the changes once they implemented this, along with some of the other managerial practices, management practices, have produced remarkable change over a 3-year period. We're actually about to I've got a draft on my desk of a brief for the next 2 years of reporting outcomes, and they report similar kinds of reductions in caseloads, and yet reductions in recidivism, improved educational achievement, improved behavioral health arena, domains as well for the youth and for their families. We think this is fundamental, and the Probation Review Management Team and the leadership here in Guam is to be congratulated for, while this review has been going on, to already select a tool, identify opportunities for training, development of the necessary documents to put this into place, the training documents, the protocols, the policies, procedures. All of this has moved forward. In fact, members of the Judiciary were trained recently in a video conference, and the juvenile probation leadership has also been subject to the initial training. But this is ongoing, and this is a huge advance in a rapid manner, and I think the leadership here is to be congratulated. I think over time, we will be able to even more clearly identify the specific kinds of treatment services that the community should be providing for our probation clients by the use of this instrument. So we're talking about the SAVERY, we're talking about the MAZY 2, which is to assess mental health needs as well. So we can get a greater picture on this. And I couldn't be more congratulatory for the leadership team already be at the point for implementation of these tools as we sit here today, just releasing the report.
Yeah, let me just add that we did have 2 trainers that came here about 3 weeks ago. There are 40 people that are still undergoing training, by the way. It was we have DYA social workers and youth service assistants, and we also trained folks from Child Protective Services. So the 40 of them, they're still under training because they're still going back and forth, submitting, I think, 3 separate cases and their evaluations. This training encompasses some review and the identification of master trainers, but basically it's for the probation officers and the other professionals in juvenile justice to implement the SAVERY. We have our client services and family counseling therapists that have been trained also to do quality control, quality assurance, and getting them to have the competencies to actually execute it. And the reason why the probation officers do it is that the result is a case management plan, an individual case plan that each probation officer will use as they manage the efforts of their client.
Yes, it is.
It is, and I can't tell you exactly what the acronym is for at this moment. I apologize for that, but I can explain the MAZY screening to you. It is a mental health screening. And so it allows you, it goes back to, as I mentioned, the Jefferson Parish ability to screen out those youth who did or did not need a further mental health evaluation. This is a quick screening that can be administered by a staff member who doesn't have clinical experience, and it will highlight if further mental health evaluation services and assessments are needed.
It's the Massachusetts Youth Screening Instrument. Massachusetts.
Yeah, okay. Senator Torres?
I'm just trying to get a picture of what the clientele is. How many children are we talking about that enter the system that are currently in DYA? I'm just trying to grasp what that profile is.
Give some input because even with, we just rotated judge assignments in January, and I would say that part of this change has been each judicial officer recognizing that we have too many up there. So last year at this time, the average was over 70. We're down to an average of 40 right now. And that's because the juvenile judges have been getting some training and making some better decisions about detention, knowing that more than 3 days of detention for certain cases causes more harm than good. So that's one front, but at all times from status, there's several hundred, maybe nearly 300 juvenile delinquent cases a year, maybe nearly 300 status offenders, and so all in all, when you count the various groups, there's nearly 700 children annually that are involved with the courts at various levels. The ones that will be getting the SAVERY would be those that are juvenile delinquents or charged with those crimes, and then even then, it would only be those that are screened as medium and high risk after a pre-screening tool is used. And I just have to say the one business in terms of implementing, this is a big thing, we still have to make the decision with the PD, the Defense Counsel, and with the AG's office about when to implement. And maybe if we won't digress too much, but maybe John can, I think that's a very critical topic that we're going to talk about on Wednesday when we meet with the judges and the lawyers, but maybe John can describe, I know it's in the report, but why it's so, when is it most effective to use it, and what are the basically 2 areas that different jurisdictions have been swinging from?
There were 2 things that I wanted to add before we move past this topic of the risk and needs assessment. The first is that I want to give credit to the Guam courts and the administrative office of the courts, because when we were brought in and asked to conduct this probation system review, they had already identified the risk, needs, responsivity assessment as an area that they wanted to highlight within this probation review. So because it's so central to the recommendations that we came up with, I wanted to make sure that it was very clear that this was on their radar before we even showed up here in Guam as a need that they saw, as an answer that they saw meeting several needs, particularly here in Guam. The second thing that I wanted to mention for the record is that the training and the guidance around the screening assessment, that was provided by the National Youth Screening and Assessment Partners out of Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Gina Vincent and Dr. Tom Grisso, he has been involved with that for many years and in fact was the developer of the Maisie 2. They have been brought in multiple times and conducted those webinars and those training events for the partners that John and both Joshua were talking about.
Yes, sir.
Will the Maisie be given in before the savory, or will the Maisie come after the savory? It would.
Well, I think that that hasn't been fully determined yet. With the adoption of these tools, part of what Joshua was speaking about is that this requires a collaboration with the Attorney General's office, certainly requires a collaboration with the judges in finalizing the process for where we'll use these tools, where those results, the scoring results, and the information that is gleaned from those tools will be used in the decision-making process. I would say, sir, that actually the next recommendation addresses some of that as part of our effort going forward. We haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay.
We haven't finalized those decisions.
It seemed to me that knowing what the mental health of the child was would be before doing the savory.
Well, actually, sometimes the savory points to, based on certain factors, brings attention to the mental health area. And just so you know, the Macy will be administered by the therapists at Client Services. And there could be many youth that do the Macy but don't also do the savory because they're low risk but have mental health issues. So that's a good point. But in terms of the decision point, something that we have to work out is when we're going to use it. Some defense counsel, although the PD right now has embraced and the AG's office have been talking about getting tools, sometimes defense counsel would object to using it too early because of admissions of guilt and things like that. I'm strongly lobbying for it to be done at the earliest part, because we're always trying to respond as fast as we understand it to the need. And if we wait till it's post-adjudication, there's going to be significant time that we lost in trying to aid or bring attention to the need. But that's something at Wednesday that I'm hoping we'll get consensus and agree to. But it's going to have to be jointly with defense and prosecution counsel.
One of the challenges that we have in using the savory is that commonly, as you know, the disposition occurs at the answering hearing. And so we're trying to look at, having more bifurcation between those two so that we allow time for the completion of the savory assessment and prior to submitting the results to the court so they're better able to understand what needs to occur.
I think you're asking the kinds of questions that is guiding this discussion forward. If I was to shift, as I am, to the 10th recommendation and the subparts of that recommendation, let me share with you just a couple of observations regarding this. First, Chief Justice Torres accurately points out, and as I've repeated, Attorney General's office, Guam Police Department, the Judiciary. This is a collaborative effort. There are decisions that have to be made together, but we're walking down a path of adopting a tool that could be used at several key decision points. To your point, how many do we have at DYA? How many do we have coming into the system? How many do we have that might be diverted from the system where we get to experience no return to that system because we more rapidly connected them to a good treatment intervention that really don't need the oversight of the court? And this tool, I think, as I said this morning, we're trying to get smarter, not softer. But this tool puts us in a position to understand more about those youth and those families that we might more expediently and more effectively target the interventions that ameliorate these risks and provide a greater public safety and accountability for these youth. So with that fundamental embrace that the Judiciary and the Probation Division has undertaken, I take us to this particular recommendation. We did engage, perhaps tediously to many of those who were in the audience, in a process review, a process mapping exercise that took each of the key decision points that are currently part of the court, part of the probation department's work, division's work, from entry on referral all the way to case closure, perhaps all the way to commitment, and then reentry. We're looking at those key points. With these recommendations put in place at this point, what we're trying to do is introduce the best practice and improved information that supports the decisions that are made at each of the key decision points in the process. And they were identified not because we told the judiciary what those were, but because we learned of what those were in working with these collaborative partners. So we're talking about, in this recommendation, prioritize key decision point changes and reforms. And we don't want to then just be done randomly, not usually or maybe, but routinely. So we recommend the adoption of protocol for guidance and the routine practice. And it could be, as you see on the screen, and this is for us to determine as a group, pre-screening for level of risk to reoffend even before a decision is made to move the petition forward. That would require working with the Attorney General's office. We've already seen a willingness, you've already heard about a willingness. Early alternative responses, such as diversion, or again, removal from the court altogether, without necessarily putting our community at any further risk, because we're moving them to appropriate treatment interventions, because we may understand what more specifically is necessary to provide that treatment. And obviously then the use of the SAVERY in the actual case plan. Now that sounds a little simpler on paper than in practice, but changing a workforce to understand, so these are the domains that are identified as most critical for us to work with in order to improve our chance of a better outcome. We may be working against some professional judgment or some historical cultural operations in the probation division that says, yeah, but I know this, and this is the instant thing that's happening, and I need to address this crisis. And you're telling me I need to focus on activities that engage in these domains. And yes, this tool suggests that, and yes, the training in this practice would suggest that. If we stay consistent on those things that are most likely to impact reoffending, we're likely to experience better outcomes. Not to the exclusion of the crisis point, but getting refocused. So this statement, this particular sub-bullet point is pretty significant, and that's why the ongoing training, the ongoing practice, perhaps even the ongoing kind of trust and faith of a juvenile probation workforce to undertake and implement this SAVERY is a long-term deal. So training curriculum and timelines for presentation to the staff and practice review schedule for fidelity to the use of these protocols and the use of this instrument, we think will get us to a better place in terms of experiencing the outcomes.
And just to give you an idea of the domains that John's talking about that are going to, evaluated, it includes, offending history, the substance abuse, attitudes towards crime, behavioral problems, personality traits, negative peer influence, school achievement, and then the presence of other protective factors. And so trying to match the use needs with the appropriate services through this informed decision-making tool will enhance, I think, the objectivity of it, reduce the risk, and increase the rates and successful completion of the services.
And as you heard Chief Justice Torres identify what those are, it's practical understanding. It's the way we talk as probation officers, but we're putting it into a systemized process so that we can more routinely practice the focus on those particular risk factors to ameliorate the risk. Yes, ma'am.
So this sounds to be pretty systematic. What's the time frame for completing the training? Because this seems to be quite an overhaul, right?
We started the training actually already 2 weeks ago, and everyone who is undertaking the training has to complete an entire case assessment.
Okay.
And so that's ongoing now, and Lonnie maybe will give me or John a better chance for when that will be completed.
Sorry, Chief Justice, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Because
Could you-
everything is being recorded.
Yeah, could you please speak into that? And this is Lonnie Brennan, the deputy for the probation division.
Hi, several of us were already trained, and what we're doing right now are case assignments. There are 3, so we should be complete by the end of September.
Okay, and then there's most likely guided practice, right? And
It's a part of the sub-recommendations. Establish practice review schedules.
Right.
There's no question, this is a long-term commitment
Yeah.
that this division has made to implement a systematic, as you properly capture, a systematic way of working with probation clients, yes. I'm an optimist. I was going to try to inject some humor and say tomorrow. We'll all be done tomorrow.
Well,
But
we
we're-
want that.
but-
We all want that. We
We're
all
just-
believe in our capacity to learn
And there's
quickly.
a tremendous capacity of leadership here to
Yes.
direct that.
You know, just because we're talking about retraining and really implementing reform, and training is a critical part of this. I started to think about our post-secondary institutions, right, upon which a lot of our service providers graduate. So if this is, Chief Justice, if this is a critical part of making the reform, is there like a plan to communicate the standards of the training that's critical to this reform to the service, the pre-service trainers,
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, even aside from the specialties that we will expect our juvenile probation officers to have, the knowledge in adolescent brain development. There's, right now we're engaging in a program on case management. Not everybody with a criminal justice degree right now is taught case management. It could be that one of the outcomes is communicating with the university to talk about the new things that are developing in this field. Just like post-commission, that's law enforcement training is not part of the degree program at UOG. And GCC provides a hybrid, and we're working with them closely on that. But you're right, the basic competencies that we would expect somebody to have, especially coming into work with juveniles, is going to be greater. And in fact, prior to launching, we worked, with our team to make sure that we had the right group. That wasn't, when they made assignments in probation, just like when they were making assignments in defense counsel or prosecution, knowledge of working with juveniles wasn't the main decision or wasn't the contributing factor in the assignment. And part of that is shifting it and knowing that these are things that should be valued and that are going to make our work successful if we do. It is a lot of training and regular training, because these fields are continuing to evolve. And having access, we acquired, fortunately, Dr. Rapadas to be on staff. That in part was because we wanted to train our probation officers with the latest information that they would have to arm themselves in working. And that would also, next year, extend into adults.
Mr. Tu, just a quick question. What's the nature of the sharing of information amongst the government entities and partners? Because just listening to Ms. Inco Sanchez from the Attorney General's office, they are also looking at applying a risk assessment tool so that they can divert some of these individuals who perhaps should not proceed to the Judiciary of Guam in terms of addressing some of their cases. So if they're going to be implementing a risk assessment tool, is that information, should that individual, that child or that youth, return back to the AG's office and go to the Judiciary Council or process, would that information be shared amongst the entities?
In that particular case, with proper authorization, certainly so. If the decision is made with use of a pre-screen device, then the results of that pre-screen, it seems to me, would certainly be part of the record that came to this next decision-making body that the case has been referred to.
So that's an ideal situation, because obviously,
yes.
Obviously, in most situations, we want to make sure that we instill efficiency into the process rather than having a risk assessment conducted at the AG's office and a risk assessment tool also be utilized at the Judiciary of Guam. That information can follow that individual.
We're definitely not looking for duplication. And in fact, the questions about when the Maisie and with the Savory and all of this, as we institute these procedures using these tools, that's why it's a web. That's why we need the partners. We need to identify when certain tools will be administered and where by whom and where that information will be used next. And very importantly, from our perspective, how we protect against that information from unauthorized disclosure, unauthorized use, so that we're looking out for the rights of the confidentiality and privacy provisions of youth and families as well.
Ms. Sanchez, did you want to add?
I
I just want to say, so we're not going to use the Savory tool full-blown. We just want like some preliminary, because first of all, GPD is going to also be able to utilize that tool, because what's going to happen in this restorative justice is there's 3 levels of how the case can be diverted. The first 2 is pre-court, pre-judiciary or pre-court intervention, which is where GPD is important that they at least have some preliminary idea as to what questions they can ask to determine if it's a low-risk offender. Of course, the obvious sign is first-time offender. That's going to, be marked as possibly illegible. So we're still working with the judiciary as far as how their risk assessment tool is being used and how we're going to use it, because we don't need the whole tool. We just need some preliminary identification to be able to say that this person is a low-risk offender. This person would probably benefit out of just the restorative justice process where, they'll be held accountable and put to the terms that need to be placed based on the victim as well. The restorative justice process is going to be a community-based process that holds them accountable to their actions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cook.
And I would say that your questions, once again, guiding us here, it goes toward an understanding that when we talk about this as a comprehensive system review, we could implement something here and something there. And if it's not coordinated on what pre-screen might be used by the AG's office, or what is currently being used by the probation division, or what information we might bring to our attention that the Guam police might have, or the education system, or the behavioral health providers with whom that youth and family may already be involved, if we're not coordinating the way we draw that information and make best decisions, then it's just a hodgepodge. And I would say that in most jurisdictions across the country, that's the way new policies get put into place. The outstanding opportunities we have here have been throughout this process. We've understood an extraordinary degree of collaboration, that the AG's office has been involved in discussions, that the judges have been involved in discussions with us. All throughout this process, we have an opportunity to streamline this so that it makes sense each step of the way and defeats the kind of outcome from the question that you raised. So let me move on to element C. And I would say, right from the we're recommending using a proven framework for data collection and data management, another thing that gets us all excited every day when we wake up in the morning, to create an effective process for using data and benchmarking to provide the probation division, the court, and its key partners with the tools necessary to consistently employ an effective QA or QI methodology. Now, what does all that say? It basically says that from our findings here, we do not believe that currently the probation division is dynamically using data to manage trends or performance. In fact, we said at the very outset, the clarity of the kind of outcomes for which we're being held accountable was not altogether up to par. So we provide guidance in our efforts to ID the relevant data. We actually provide a particular article and maybe providing some of that on-site technical assistance that gives great guidance to how it is we identify those data characteristics, those data points, and a way in which we can collect that to really have an aggregate outcome performance measurement for the youth and for our system. It would create a management report for the probation division that is routinely used to oversee the trends and the understanding of whether or not we're succeeding in our practices or whether or not we're failing. I think this group should be held accountable, or should be the group that holds the division accountable. Are we meeting our goals? We're making a recommendation for a method by which the probation division to begin to collect this data, begin to manage this data, and use it to keep us on track towards achieving those outcomes. Just a couple of the pieces. It's the prevalence. It's an understanding how many cases are coming in and what kinds of cases, how many misdemeanors, how many felonies. It's the characteristics. Who are the youth? We certainly understand that there's a minority population in terms of the census that represents a majority population in terms of the juvenile justice system. We need to be all over that as we go forward and understand where that lies in our functioning. Another place where we should be capturing data is in the actual case management, and then of course in the system and youth outcomes. Basically, it allows us to say what's working, what's not, what's the plan to change and alter that practice or protocol that may be undermining our success. It's not glitzy, it's not glamorous, but it's essential for this division to be accountable going forward and to actually assess whether or not, if we're implementing these new practices, that we're actually achieving the kind of outcomes that we would seek to report on proudly. So again, nothing particularly glamorous, but the data piece is critical. And we certainly have a ways to go here in the probation division to be able to position us to have that kind of reporting accountability going forward. Categories of performance measures for probation officers that correspond with the desired youth and system outcomes. So this is a data point. This is about case management. But folks, if probation officers understand, these two recommendations get to this. If probation officers understand that these activities that they engage in have a clear connection to amelioration of the risk and achievement of the kind of outcomes for which the department is now going to more clearly identify they are going to be held accountable, then those are the activities those probation officers should be engaging in their routine practice. Okay? There's a way of identifying those. The research has made it clear for us to identify those that help ameliorate the risk in certain domains, that help identify how we work with the police department, the AG's office, the school, our behavioral health providers in a better way. Those are the activities we want probation officers to be engaged in. And we can, once again, to the system reform, we can systematize the priority and the importance of those activities by then subsequently including them in the performance evaluation for those JPOs. It just makes sense. If we are guiding, driving, directing, supervising, managing the JPOs to be involved in those activities, we have an increased likelihood of achieving those positive outcomes. And then shouldn't we reward those probation officers for engaging those activities by recognizing that they've adhered to those systematically in their performance evaluation? So our effort here is once all the policies and practices and processes are put in place, and we can more clearly define what those probation officers should be engaged in, and then provide direction, managerial oversight to get them engaged in that. And we should start to see better outcomes. That is not a short-term solution. That will not, to my impatience, happen tomorrow. But it is a systematic reform. I believe Josh may have said, maybe the Chief Justice, it is a transformation that will take months, perhaps into a year or two for us to fully realize in this transformation. Carrie.
We are rounding out towards the end of our recommendations, and I'd like to talk to you for a moment about the recommendations we made under the inter and intra-agency services element. As I mentioned earlier, one of the core principles, again, is cross-system collaboration in meeting the youth's needs. And one of the findings that we first identified when we conducted this part of the review was that the division's relationship with the judiciary is very positive. In fact, judges summarized their experience with the division as excellent, and they noted that probation officers often exhibit an attitude of going above and beyond. 73% of the probation officers feel respected by the judiciary, and however, consistent feedback also included the fact that both from the probation officer's perspective and the judiciary's perspective, they wanted more information to be shared. And this speaks directly back to the risk needs assessment. When a judge asks the probation officer, what are the needs in this youth's life, the probation officer will be able to speak to that, as well as how the youth is progressing within their treatment plan, as I'll talk about in the next recommendation. A second finding under the inter and interagency services is that there is an opportunity within the school resource officer program, to improve some clarification around the school resource officer's role and authority, that sometimes there is some confusion about who is in charge of the school resource officer's duties, because the school resource officer program is funded by the Department of Education, and yet it is supervised by the probation division. Our recommendation then was to develop a leadership working group that involves education, probation, and court administration to jointly and more specifically identify both the future funding of SROs, the role and authority of SROs in the schools, and to develop an agreement that memorializes these facets of the interagency relationship. And in fact, this afternoon, the conversations will begin between the DOE and the courts and the administrative office of the courts and probation. The third finding under this particular element identified both a need and an opportunity to operationalize and standardize the communication mechanisms between the probation division and the external agencies that provide services for youth. This speaks to, are there standard referral processes when a youth needs to connect to a service? What does the information exchange look like as that youth progresses through service? And what can be provided back to the probation officer and then given to the judge? So we recommend creating an internal working group of probation management and JPOs to develop a protocol that oversees these particular job tasks, communication processes, and so on. John hasn't mentioned it today, but one of the highlights that we often say in our review is we're not big fans of sometimes, maybe, and possibly. We really are here to encourage departments to operationalize their procedures so that everyone knows what should happen every time it happens. The other thing I want to add, because this speaks back to recommendation 8 in communicating with the external service providers, in that recommendation we also wanted to highlight the fact that it's important to begin to identify what the outcomes are of these service providers. Not only matching the youth's needs to the correct service provider that can meet it, but what kind of quality assurance processes are in place so that you know the funds that are being used to provide services to these youth are being well utilized, that you're getting an evidence-based program ideally, and that they're meeting the needs that the youth has and that the judges and the probation department are hoping will actually be accomplished. So this, again, just ties into recommendation 9. This actually concludes our recommendations. If you have any questions about the last few that we covered, we welcome them at this time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering about the SRO program. Do you have any evidence right now about the effectiveness of that program?
I think some of the evidence is in the dramatic reduction in the anti-bullying and school violence reports that DOE have been putting forward. I would say that definitely that's one indication. But I think that there are other issues still that remain unresolved with that program, and I'm not convinced that we're utilizing the SROs to the greatest extent as possible. Some principals are and have great integrated programs, some aren't, and it really varies. And the fact that it varies shows us that that there's some work that I think needs to happen and grow in that area with the SROs. That's a big thing. We're seeing Department of Education this afternoon. In fact, as I understand it, all the principals from secondary are coming down so they can talk with us about the superintendent's plans for JP Torres and trying to address that. And we feel very vested that we need to help them with that, since we're trying to really cut off that school-to-prison pipeline, which some may say is festering over there in that program. So that's one. But I just wanted to say that the reason why we came today is to tell you what basically we're going to be embarking on. This report is not an ends. This is describing to you the master plan that we're going to approach transforming. And I do say it's a transformation of how we work in juvenile probation. For many years, it's been about enforcing judges' orders. Many times, probation officers didn't feel an opportunity to affect an outcome of their client because they never were able to have tools to identify and measure what was happening in the home, or how to reconcile information that was being passed on from other agencies and making it useful for these judges to come up with a successful plan so we can reduce the flow. I mentioned today that a lot of these notorious criminals that are making it in the news for very many things, they call it the brown folders. I say that because it's the term that the clerks developed to describe people that had extensive criminal histories, and understanding that many of these started when they were juveniles. Probation officers knowing that the system failed the kids because they weren't able to act on places where there were no parents involved, or where both parents were substance abusers. So the point of this is to tell you that we're moving in a direction where we want to be able to be guided by the evidence, be guided by the numbers, be able to provide quality, individualized case management to medium and high risk children. And I want to just say that it's a big request that we have, because as you pointed out, Senator, we never trained our probation officers to do this. Part of the isolation of Guam and not being involved in American Probation and Parole Association because of budget cuts meant that we were disjointed from what was happening in the country. And of course, there are jurisdictions that are way behind where we are. But what we're asking for, and what we've been wanting to commend the juvenile probation officers, is for being very willing to embrace the change and to go forward. If you look at them, many of them are actually brand new, which in some respects is a blessing for us, because they're ripe, they have the energy, they're willing to take this. And the senior officers that are there are some of the best that we've had in the court. They've been willing and able to embrace the change. They're a little nervous, I'll tell you. Some of them, they have 140 cases, which we know is not effective. They should have less cases, and part of it is a long-standing practice of not sorting the youth, and for judges giving them the same kind of pretrial or release conditions that they give to others. And that's because we weren't, I don't think that we were also giving probation and the judges tools to sort that. So our goal is to try and, working with the other partners, to try and establish some good diversion programs. You heard that from the Attorney General's office. We've been working closely with the police. We're excited with their leadership also there on the different ways that we can affect this group of people. And I just want to tell you that we're hoping for good success, so that it could be an indicator for the plans we have for adults. And we'll be unveiling our plans and identifying ways to really tackle a really big problem there in what we believe is there. And I do want to point out that a lot of these changes started really from probation's leadership. Going out and seeing some of the successes that other jurisdictions had, coming back and talking to us, some of the judges even, smarter sentencing, trying to be a bit more effective. A lot of that, definitely were heard by the Chief Justice and I, and the other leaders, trying to give them the resources they can to really do a systematic change. And the evidence of whether it'll work, I'm confident, will show in the numbers that we'll be able to provide you and the public going forward on a regular basis. Being driven by data, I think, is something that is not necessarily a norm here in Guam. I think not many people read on Guam. Unfortunately, they don't take the interest. And so being able to try and be informed and giving the court professionals and our partners opportunities to move in that direction, I think, is where we need to go. But
Josh, can we quickly go through our, this juvenile justice, the probation review was one aspect of the juvenile justice reform efforts that the court is undertaking. We had 4 different subcommittees that were formed to evaluate different areas, and just wrapping up here, if we can just go through those very quickly, because I know time is at a premium.
That's right.
We have a family.
As you know, the first one, really our juvenile probation review was in Committee 1, which is implementing evidence-based practices and acquiring the risk and needs assessment tools. And so you'll see that. And I also mentioned earlier that because of the information and knowledge, the judges have been doing their part trying to reduce the number of children that are being detained at DYA from 70 on average to 70 down to around 40, with still more work to be done. Part of this also is acquiring good personnel to help us, and so we've recruited, I mentioned Dr. Rapadas. We have a statistician that's joining us that is going to help us move into the area where we'll be more data-driven and understanding the numbers that are coming. Also, a wholesale review of our alternative sentencing office and identifying new programs that will be able to offer juveniles. Moving to service learning, away from community service into service learning, and different things that our Justice Corps volunteers will be able to help us accomplish. and aligning of those with things that are demonstrated to work. Now, the second subcommittee had to do with juvenile court referral process. You heard this from Carol when she talked about trying to getting some diversion programs created with the Office of the Attorney General. We're also looking at truancy. We know truancy is a big issue. This committee's taking a look at what's called the Court Unified Truancy Suppression Program in Maricopa County in Arizona, we're advocating earlier intervention in truancy rather than waiting. In some cases, I think the superintendent knows for many decades, you're basically months into it before we get involved. And also looking at mediation. Carol also mentioned restorative justice. That's a big area that will be used to try and reduce the court referrals coming into the court. There's some legislation that will be transmitted to you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee has drafted some legislation to help us amend the family court rules so that agencies are able to share information more with each other, so that they're able to respond to the needs of students. In fact, there was also a policy that has been submitted to the DOE board to help move faster and quicker on attendance and truancy. And also this area was identifying an area that was creating truants, where undocumented migrants from the freely associated states were not or are not being able to get into school because they lack the primary documentation DOE requires for admission, and that's another area that is being worked on. The third one having to do with standards for attorneys in juvenile defense and juvenile prosecution attorneys continues to work. There's a committee with our private practitioners that's been meeting twice a month. They've gone through 9 out of the 10 model rules for juvenile defense SPAR. They'll be moving into the prosecution realm after they're done with that. So that we could stop the practice. I think we were stopping the practice of just sending in junior attorneys in to cover juvenile hearings because that was the thing that they used to do, and trying to push a defense bar to understand and be able to understand adolescent development so they can make informed decisions about their defense. They'll be completing their work in about 6 months. And then finally, Subcommittee 4 with court language. Many times the kids don't know what's happening to them in court, or the judges are giving them conditions that they just don't understand. And this committee has been working on really taking a look at all of those things that are being said and making it in a form that is more understood by the juveniles and in many cases their parents, so that we can give them an opportunity to succeed. So you'll see that we have certain things that are being done. We're about ready to launch a bunch of changes inside the courtroom as well. And that's it for the 4 areas. We're ready if there's any other issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tenorio, Mr. Chief Justice, and Mr. Toole and Ms. Harp. I understand that you also would like to provide some brief additional comments, but I'd like to just allow our partner agencies to be able to provide comment. We did hear from the Attorney General's office, so thank you very much, Ms. Sanchez. Chief?
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to of this reform. So we are looking forward to that in assisting the judiciary and the probation with that. In particular, the savory, because based on what I was briefed and what I heard this morning, I think that this type of initiative is something that is going to be instrumental for us in the department as well, which kind of also falls in line with some of the initiatives that my bosses that have pushed down to me to take a look at for the Guam Police Department. So definitely we're on line with that. And from the perspective of the police department, in particular our juvenile investigations section, we definitely support this initiative. I wanted to bring to light, as Senator Underwood had brought up, the issue of the SROs. I think that based on what I've been briefed with regards to the SRO, from my lowest ranking officers all the way up to my police commander, I believe that there's somewhat of a disconnect with regards to how SROs are employed and the Guam Police Department's role with those SROs. And I've seen and I've heard the frustrations of my officers out in the field and all the way up to the commanders that have to employ those officers out there. So I know that there's a meeting this afternoon. I will be there just so that I can hear what's going on and get better situational awareness. But I think that we kind of need to work that out. The whole implementation of the SRO was something that my predecessor was on board with and understood. And I think that the concept and how our officers are working with SROs out there, there's somewhat of a disconnect, which is a little frustrating for our officers out on the road. So I think that's something we probably need to address just a little bit. But otherwise, aside from that, I would say that everything I've heard and everything I've been briefed, definitely from the Guam Police Department, we're in support of all that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chief. Mr. Mendiola?
Thank you. Adonis Mendiola, Director, Department of Youth Affairs. I want to say thank you, obviously, to the Chair, Vice Speaker, Senator Underwood, and of course, Senator Torres for hosting us here. This movement is monumental, at least for juvenile justice reform. I know that, Vice Speaker, we entered into the juvenile justice law review when we first came in the administration, and it was a difficult task to look at our laws, look at our processes, and even with that limitation, to also bring in courts to look at it holistically. And I want to say thank you to obviously the support that is owed to the worthy leadership at the courts. Take a look at this and really treat it with extreme attention, because we have actually seen a great many results just in the last year, and I wanted to share with you our CCR will be out shortly. We've seen a drop, at least in our terms or definition of recidivism, by 7% at DYA. And so I want to say thank you, obviously, not just to the courts, but also to GDOE. And that's significant for us. We've seen a reduced population. Obviously, we've also been working on our facilities as well to make that behavioral change a little bit more possible, along with case management and the other therapists involved. So I just want to say that the Savory, the Maisie, is going to make this very, very possible for many of our staff who are obviously sometimes beleaguered by that caseload, to help lighten it, but also to give that focus where it really needs to be, which is the outcomes, the positive outcomes. And so we'll obviously mirror and obviously take a page out of not just what JP is doing in the system, but for us also changing the paradigm for our youth service workers to be more part of the behavioral change, as well as the monitoring and oversight, and maybe extend that back out into our resource centers. And to that point, our resources centers are a great boon to recidivism and lowering it. And although the monies that we were hoping to get for this fiscal year, this next fiscal year, to help stand that back up, we will still work with the Judiciary. In fact, Josh and I had met about how exciting it will be to use their Justice Corps along with the JP and bring activities into our resource centers. So obviously we have facilities that we want the rest of the community to benefit from, so that we can obviously divert the youth in conjunction with the AGs, divert the youth from obviously entering the system using our resource centers. And we have 3 of those, by the way, that extend themselves to regions and areas that are of real focus for where these youth are coming from, in particular some of the populations and ethnicities. But thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mendiola. Vice Speaker Cruz?
Just a quick question. You made mention of our new migrants. Is the Savory or the Maisie going to be able to address that? That cultural difference, and how to be able to address it?
Well, first is that we did train we have 3 Chukis interpreters that were trained with the probation officers and youth service workers, because they're going to be interpreting for those that need. They're not expected to conduct it, but they are going to be a big instrument to help us, including in speaking with the parents or whoever the responsible adult is in the life. So I would say yes. Dr. Vincent, who is the expert on that, and their team that were here, they were not present. We selected this together. I mean, we selected it. They gave us some information, but the tool was selected based on socioeconomic demography of Guam, things that have worked in other jurisdictions where they see, some migrant populations being overrepresented in the system, and we do have a big issue. I know you know it, but we've been talking also in some other committees with the chief of police that we have overrepresented population in the system, that it requires us to come up with some strategies to try and address. And that's a big cornerstone or a big priority for us at the court. And even in the System of Care Council that I'm sitting on with the chief of police, we've been talking about this. It's one of the biggest problems, I think, or the issues that the island is facing. And a lot of people are unsure how to proceed, but we're going to give it a shot.
You have to really pay attention to the translation of a standardized instrument. And so the training of that really needs to be in collaboration with the developers. Because I know that in dealing with assessment, especially those that are norm reference or standardized, that the translation, the manner by which you administer it can really affect the outcome.
Absolutely.
And so, I would just really especially with our population that are linguistically and culturally different and do not have the language proficiency.
Mr. Chief Justice,
I
Dr.
just
Rapatos
wanted
wants
to make note of that.
Just to let you know, hi, good morning. The SABRI actually works a lot on historical data. So to that question, it's absolutely true. We need to do that. But the nice thing about it is a lot of the SABRI is you just need to look at the records and what's happening with this family, so that if you wanted to clarify a question, maybe use the interpreter to clarify a question in the SABRI. But a lot of the information is, you can look at it and see if they've committed 3 or 4 offenses, drinking in school. And then we look at all the records and see. And just a real quick comment about risk and needs assessment. Being that I just moved from the DOA to the courts, I've been harping on having a risk and needs assessment forever. And actually, DYA is going to be likely using the MAZI with every kid that comes in. It's 54 items. It can be done in 10 minutes. And we do a kind of MAZI anyway, unstructured. So this is kind of a structured way. It gives us a low, medium risk. And then the social workers and case managers can look at what to do. So just to let you know that this is the way to go. This is the state of the art. The SABRI is a much longer process, 2.5 hours. So.
Thank you, Dr. Rapatos. Mr. Tu and Ms. Harp, if you would like to provide closing comments, and then Chief.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, but I want to make sure that we offer proper thanks, and to Chief Justice Torres, to Josh Tenorio, particularly. My first meeting with them produced this and an extraordinary opportunity for Guam and the youth of Guam. We're excited about that, and I want to thank them. I would say that in our decades-long experience with multiple state and local jurisdictions, Judiciary of Guam, and the professionals that comprise what we've called the Guam Probation Review Management Team, some of whom have been referenced here, certainly I need to call out the juvenile probation officers as well. They sat with us on numerous occasions. Sometimes they had to be prodded to speak with us, but I think they spoke openly, they spoke honestly, and they provided us an understanding of what's really going on right now. Many of them are in the room. They should be congratulated for that open and honesty. But the Probation Review Management Team, with whom we did work closely throughout this process, I think the committee should know they demonstrated the highest level of professionalism. It was evidenced by their openness, their honest self-evaluation, their diligent attention to detail, and motivation to improve the practices on behalf of the youth of Guam. Their efforts have been exemplary from all the reviews that we've conducted. They should provide a high degree of confidence that the Guam Probation Division will continue on its current path to, as Chief Justice Torres has said, develop a successful, practical, and feasible model of system-wide reform on behalf of the youth here. It's been our privilege at the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center, and on behalf of Carrie and myself, we'd like to thank you all for the incredible hospitality, welcome, and the opportunity to conduct this review and perhaps support some positive reforms going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tu. And likewise, we want to extend our appreciation for the partnership that you've established with the Judiciary of Guam, and most importantly, on behalf of all the people of Guam, because the end result is a positive outcome for assisting and developing our youth, even to a greater extent.
I
Chief
think
Justice?
John did a great job of summarizing why we undertook this effort at the onset, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank our probation review management team. They put in a lot of hours, a lot of time, even after hours, to ensure that we got to this day where the final report could be published and disseminated, and really just paving the way forward for the future success that we hope to see with our juvenile justice system. So thank you, Senators, for allowing us to make this presentation. Thank you to our key stakeholders for being here. We know how important it is for them. We appreciate their contributions, and they're going to continue to be involved with us as we make a difference for the children of our island.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chief Justice, and this concludes our roundtable discussion. Thank you.